Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents, and also happy Valentine's Day. So, if like me, you hated it, but you're like, oh, I haven't had a Valentine of anyone, you've just had one from me. Anyway, this time I'm really quite pleased to be able to say that we're actually going to be talking about romance folklore, and I'm going to be chatting with Komal Salman, who is a creative professional and founder at Folkloristan, where technology meets storytelling to preserve oral Pakistani heritage. With a background in media studies, Komal is also the content strategist at Atom Camp, a tech ed platform. A writer and an illustrator, her passion for history and folklore fuels her creative endeavours, leading to most of her work being influenced and inspired by culture, myth, and magic. So, in this particular interview, we're going to be chatting about some of the romantic tales in Pakistan's folklore. We're going to be enjoying a story about fairies because they do get everywhere, and we'll be chatting about the different influences on stories in the region. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you had me on board here, and I'm really excited to have a good chat. I hope you do well.
Yeah, we've got a really interesting topic here, and obviously because it's February and therefore, and this episode's going to go out on Valentine's Day as well. So you wanted to talk about kind of like romance stories and love stories and things in Pakistan's folklore. So for people who aren't familiar, what would be a good example of a romantic story?
It depends on what kind of romance you were looking for, to be honest. But I think one of Pakistan's most famous love stories is the Heer Ranjha, even though it's a little tragic. And then we have Musa Khan Gul Makai, which is happily ever after. And we have Sefil Manu, which is again a romance, a happy one, but it's between the fairy and a prince.
Cool. So you mentioned there that one of the sort of oh, this one has a happy ending. Does that mean that there are stories that don't have happy endings?
Actually, most of them don't have happy endings. Love stories don't end well. There's always either an intertribal dispute or, yeah, just somehow the couple ends up dying in the end.
Okay, that's hardcore. Why is that then? Why would you have so many stories? I mean, that's I think probably other places do as well, but why would you have so many sort of tragedies, particularly related to romance?
I think there's two factors involved in it. The first one being that in our culture, arranged marriages are the norm. They still are the norm. And folklore just sort of reinforces that concept that don't fall in love, especially not outside your tribe or outside your ethnicity or in the neighboring kingdom or whatever. But beyond that, I also think that even though all of these stories come off as tragedies, they've been written with a very Sufistic sort of twist to them. The idea is to be united forever in the eternal world. Because in Muslim tradition, we believe in the afterlife, which is supposed to be forever. So in death, two souls unite forever. That is the whole idea, which is probably why we have so many tragedies per se.
Mhm. So would people sort of, I guess in Western cultures, would they recognize any of the sort of are there like similar story types, or would they be? And I'm thinking like the happy ever after ones, those would they be sort of more familiar, do you think?
I think I think, to be honest, I think we have both. Some of them are really famous, the happy ones and the tragic ones. But like there's this one particular story about the seven queens of sin. It's a very famous Hindi epic. It's called the Shah Jahan Salo. Most of the stories are tragic, and it's been translated into multiple languages. And also, a lot of these Pakistani stories, they also have iterations in India, in Bangla, in Persia, and in Arab folklore. So, which is why a lot of these apparently tragic romances also, they're pretty well known to people outside.
Hmm. So how do any of them go for anybody who like would you like to sort of tell one for anyone who doesn't know any of these sort of story types or isn't familiar with them?
Yeah, I think I would be happy to tell one.
Cool.
Would you like a happy one or a sad or a
Uh,
fairy one?
part of me is like a sad one, but I think most people would probably want a happy one.
Yeah, I think it's Valentine's Day. We should go with happy vibes. Let's not depress people. Okay, so this is the legend of a lake. The lake is called Sefil Maluk, and it's in Naran Kawan in KP in Pakistan, slightly towards the north of the country. Once upon a time, there lived an Egyptian prince, and his name was Sefil Maluk. Hunting was one of his favorite sports, so he often traveled far and wide to find game. One day, he was hunting in the midst of beautiful mountains in a faraway land, and he saw a deer unlike any other. The antelope had magnificent antlers, which curled like a snake. Mesmerized by the animal, he left his companions behind and gave the deer a good long chase. The deer led him to a lake surrounded by beautiful flowers. Prince Sefil Maluk was convinced that there was something magical about the place. He had seen reflections of the sky lakes earlier, but this lake was different. The full moon in the sky seemed to set the entire surface of the lake aglow. His suspicions turned out to be correct when he saw the most stunning of fairies sitting among the flowers. The graceful and gazelle-eyed creature, with skin as pale as the moon, with thick dark locks of hair falling over her shoulders, introduced herself as Badri Jamala. The prince was mesmerized by her and a little dumbfounded. He had come to catch a deer, and he had found a fairy. The prince got over his initial feelings of shock and fear, and the two began to talk. Eventually, they became friends, and then they became lovers. They met at the lakeside every single night. The tale of their romance spread far and wide, and rightly so, for it was a love story between a fairy and a prince. One day, Badri Jamala did not show up at the lake. Saiful Maluk waited by the lakeside all night for her, but she did not arrive. Dejected, he went back to his tent. The following night, the same happened. The prince became very worried. He wondered if misfortune had fallen his beloved, so he set out to search for her. 6 years passed by with no luck, but the prince refused to go back to his homeland, back to Egypt, until he had found his fairy, his Badri Jamala. Till one day he chanced upon a group of fairies bathing in the lake. They told him that Badri Jamala had been kidnapped by Toraban Deo, and he had taken her away to his fortress in Kohikaf and locked her up. Swearing to free her from prison, Satul Maluk ventured into the world of the jinns and the deos and rescued her from the fort. When Toraban discovered that Jamala was gone, he flew into rage. In his anger, he flooded the entire valley and commanded the water to destroy everything in its path. The flood pushed the fugitives to run over to the mountains. There, Saiful Maluk and Badri Jamala sought refuge in an enchanted cave near the lake. Toraban Deo kept searching for Badri Jamala, but his efforts went in vain. He even shed tears of grief, for he had fallen in love with her, but she did not agree to become his wife. Aware of the fact that she hated him for keeping her locked away in his castle, it broke his heart because this was the only way to keep her close to him. It is said that Torabandio wept so profusely that his tears formed another lake, Ansujil, the Lake of Tears. It is said that the couple lived the rest of their lives in the safety of the cave, terrified of being parted from one another ever again. Glimpses of the string of colorful glowing orbs floating, floating across the lake as they dance can be seen by a lucky few when the couple comes out of the cave and dances across the surface of the lake on the 14th of every lunar month when the moon is full.
That's still kind of sad a little bit.
Um, so just to put things into context a little, Kohe Kaf is also known as Mount Kaf in English, and it is the mythical kingdom where the jinns live. And the deos are actually a creature Pakistan has adopted from Persian folklore. They're known as divs in Persian, and they're usually bigger and most often more evil than the jinns.
Right, okay, cool. So with a story like that, how sort of well known is that? Is that something that like everyone grows up hearing as a child, or is it something that kind of you'd have to have more of
Um,
an interest in folklore?
yeah, actually, this is a story almost everyone knows.
Hmm.
Even if they haven't heard the whole story, they've heard it somewhere. because this was written by a very famous poet, and the verses are so easy to learn that almost everybody knows it.
Hmm.
I grew up hearing the verses from my grandma, and I had no idea what it was. And also because Naran is a very common picnic spot, especially in summer. So people go to the lake and people hear the story because there are storytellers who permanently just sit by the lake and tell the story.
Oh, cool. I was quite interested when you were saying fairies there. Are fairies common in folklore in Pakistan?
Yes, actually, fairies are very common in folklore in Pakistan, but there's a slight um, so basically, the actual word for fairy in Urdu is pari. And the pari inherently is never evil. She's always a good creature and a good omen. And they're always very pretty and dainty, unlike what you see in Western folklore or Celtic folklore, where they can be good, they can be evil, they can curse you, they can be ugly sometimes. That's not the case in Pakistan.
Cool. It's always really interesting to see how much kind of fairies pop up around the world and how they're so. Do you get sort of male fairies as well, or are they always female?
Yeah, we also have male fairies. They're called Parizad, and we also have this legend about a fairy prince. So the prince was like half mortal and half fairy. It's only Baloch folklore, which sort of is a little wary of the fairies, but otherwise, even mermaids, because they're called Jalpari in Punjabi, for the most part, they're also good omens. That's just the depiction of fairies in South Asia and the Persian network.
Oh, cool. That's interesting. Um, because it is always interesting seeing how these different figures kind of vary anywhere that they pop up. I always kind of wonder like what the family reunion would be like, sort of between like nice fairies and then not very nice fairies.
I think part of it may have had to do with this really old translation of the Quran when Islam was very new to the region. Because the Quran mentions angels and jinns, which were foreign concepts to the Persians and to the South Asians. The translation actually referred to the jinns as deos and the angels as fairies. So I think that just sort of cemented the belief that fairies are always good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would make sense. So you mentioned there about the the translation of the Quran. So obviously because of the part of the world that it is, you've got quite a lot of different influences. So what kind of influences are most common on the folk tales, and how does that sort of help connect into sort of the geography and the history of the region?
I think besides our own ethnic influences, there's a very pronounced influence from Persia, India, and even some Buddhism. And yes, Arab, Middle Eastern, North African folklore. Because again, Pakistan also has an African community. They're called the Shidis. So they brought their own beliefs along with them. So I think it's a fairly nice mix. You can't really pick and choose that one influences more and one is less.
So do you think that with all these different influences that you have, that that sort of helps to explain anything in particular about the folklore, or does it help to explain anything sort of particular about the specifically the romantic based stories?
I think actually a lot of the romances are actually shared. Like we have Leela and Chanasar, which is common between Pakistan and Iran. We have Leila Majnun, which is common between the Arab world and South Asia. Then we have, because we share languages with Afghanistan and with Iran and with India, so there's quite a lot of fair bit of overlap there.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know when we're sort of planning what we're going to talk about, you did mention that there's a different sort of role for women in a lot of these stories that differs quite a lot from sort of Western. I kind of hesitate to call it feminism, but I guess the way that sort of people would expect to see it in the West. How does the agency of women sort of differ, and what would you say we can learn from that?
There's a lot of folklore which women have written and traditionally composed. Even though all of it has not been recorded, that includes wartime celebrations, wedding celebrations. spinning the wheel, grinding the flour, doing the laundry. Um, so it's just sort of, I think that itself is a lot of agency because the tapa is traditionally just couplets. You can rhyme anything with anything, and there you have it. And also, there's this one particular story of Shada and Mehnaz. Mehnaz's husband blames her for disloyalty, so she does the customary test. And after that, even though she passes the test to restore her family's honor, she refuses to go back to her husband, and her family is all for it. Then in Pashtun folklore, there is this one legend of women going to war. Actually, more than one legend, but one specific legend in which there was a Pashtun war with the Mongols, and it was actually female archers who sort of led the front lines. Now, why this makes sense is because when a woman is going to war, she's obviously at risk of a lot of things, which includes being killed, being attacked, whatever. And all of these women used to, the unmarried women used to go dressed up with henna, with kohol, with their jewelry, because in Pashtun tradition, women who used to die as maidens were first dressed as brides and then prepared for their funerals. So it was sort of a message to the enemy that we've come prepared. But at the same time, in another story, a tribe ends up losing its whole kingdom because this one young man pulls the veil off another girl and they end up going to war. So the point being that whilst disrespect is not associated to your physical body, it is if the other person is intentionally disrespecting you, not if you're at risk because you're out there with a purpose. And I think that's a very important thing we can learn.
Hmm. So do you think that these stories have a sort of like a message for people in the 21st century, or is it too difficult to kind of apply older ideas kind of to a modern context?
The 21st century, as we know it, does not have the same applications across Pakistan. Not yet, anyway. In Islamabad, no. In a small village, yes. Mm, what happens in Pakistan is that we still have, given the whole global north, global south divide, Pakistan itself has an additional divide between the rural and the urban. Like the villages got internet at least a good 10 years after. And even though they have the internet and now a lot of these kids, guys and girls alike, are going to schools, the cultural norms are still very, very strong. So to those people, I think these stories do have a very important message.
Hmm.
And since we're an agro-based economy, apart from 4 or 5 bigger metropolitan cities, I think it more or less applies to the entire country, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose the other thing, kind of the elephant in the room, as it were, is the idea of obviously the various waves of colonialism that there's been in the area. And one of the things that I've noticed with some stories is there can be like that like undertone of anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism and so on in them, and then other ones just sort of don't acknowledge it, perhaps because of the point at which they were actually written. So, in these particular romantic stories, do we find any evidence of anti-colonialism, or have they got like a different set of considerations?
There is this one story in particular, which is believed to have been written during the Portuguese invasion of Macau. And the commander decides to stay loyal to his wife, even though the Portuguese have offered to give him a wife so his kids can keep the throne. So there's that romance of Mir Hammal and his wife with this tone of colonialism. Other stories also have colonial tones. Like, for example, there's this one romance in Pashto of the first Mughal king, Babur, and one of his wives. So colonialism, not necessarily Western colonialism, because present-day Pakistan has been a part of Persia, of various Central Asian empires, of the Mongol Empire, of pretty much everyone.
Okay. So if anybody asked you to sum up the difference between sort of like romantic folk tales from Pakistan and the folk tales from somewhere else in the region, how would you sort of see them as, would you see them as being the same, or would you see them as being sort of different?
They're a little different. Like there are some stories which have Islamic influences, not in the kind that it's on your face, but there's this one romance in which the baby girl and the baby boy were both born in two different houses. Their parents are told by the astrologers that this girl is going to bring bad luck. That girl is put in a very well decorated basket and set to float across the river. And if you start to compare it, it has very close influences from the story of Musa, Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, which is known as Moses in biblical tradition. So, just bits and pieces here and there. And then I think there's this specific tribal code of honor, which is very overwhelmingly present in folklore and romances throughout Pakistan. And I think it's present regardless of which ethnicity you're from. It touches upon very basic things like if you've given your word to someone you love, you have to stand by it. No ifs and no buts. And then there's this one other specific folktale in which the guy actually kidnaps the bride from her wedding day because they're in love with each other, but she refuses to get married to him until her father agrees. So there's that thing of not letting your parents down, regardless of however hard things are.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there's this theme of being united forever in love. Then you see motives like someone trying to swim across a river or trying to cross the desert bare feet. Just again, coming down to the fact that if you love someone, then you love them. Don't make excuses to ghost them.
Oh, I like that. Oh. So if people wanted to sort of learn more about these kind of stories, where would be the best place for them to go to find out about that?
I've uploaded a couple of them on my website, and I think you can start there. And then there's a few books. There's the Shajar Salo, there's a book on Pashtun romances. I don't know if it has an English translation though, because I read it in Urdu. There's a lot of stories from the Persian Book of Kings, also adopted by Pakistani folklore. You can look up Yusuf Zulaikha. This is again a folktale we've adopted from Islamic tradition. And yeah, most of our epics are written in the form of poetry. I don't know how many of them have actually been translated into English because the epics go for like 500, 600, 1,000 pages, and it's all poetry, which makes it very hard to translate. And also, I think when I translate, sometimes I just feel like there's sort of this linguistic barrier. Even though English has been my adapted language of sorts, I just feel like English does not have the same depth as Urdu. And a lot of the concepts we're familiar with in Urdu and our brain just picks them up. It's very hard to explain them to an audience with no context
Mhm.
in very less words.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that being a problem actually, because it is that thing. It's not just simply translating the language, it's obviously all the culture and everything and history
Yeah.
and yeah.
So I usually add footnotes to my stories, just explaining everything else.
Yeah. I do love a good footnote. So you mentioned obviously that you've got stuff on your website. Where can people find you online, and what's the best way for people to interact with you?
You can find us on Instagram or on Twitter. We go by the name of Folkloristan, and our website is also www.folkloristan.com. You can find us there. And you can also find us on Redbubble. I, on occasion, put up some of our illustrations and some of our artworks for sale.
So you've mentioned We an Hour a few times there. So just finally, tell us a bit about what the Folkloristan project is actually about.
Okay, so it started off as a passion project. I'll tell you how I started it. It was COVID, and we were obviously distance learning. I was still in my undergrad. We were supposed to do this policy paper on one specific media industry. I decided to pick folklore. In doing that paper, I read about this dead Japanese guy. I keep forgetting his name. He just sort of put out an ad in the newspaper and collected a lot of folklore and just published a book out of it. And I was like, that sounds like a good idea. I don't have access to a newspaper, but I can tweet. So I tweeted and I just put together like 100 stories. Again, so much of free time on our hands, I had nothing to do. Nobody wanted to publish it. So I was like, okay, so it was just sitting on my laptop till I interned with Sir Imran Ghazali in the digital media wing set up by the former government of Prime Minister Imran Khan. I pitched the idea to them and they were like, okay, do it, set up your website. They helped me get started. And it was just a hobby till I finished university. And then I was like, I can post more often. Eventually, with consistency, it just sort of built into a brand. And then I started picking up on slightly more difficult projects. Like we did a whole Gothic map of Pakistani folklore. So I just sort of collated my folklore. I did a map of Sufi shrines mapped by district because, in particular, Sindh and Punjab have a very, very strong Sufi culture. And we did this one collaboration with a Japanese artist to sort of map out Pakistani attire. Not map, but like draw anime characters in Pakistani attire, traditional ethnic attires. I think that was really fun. And other than that, most of my focus is on illustrations because I feel like if we need to preserve something, we need to see it to remember it. And also, my primary audience is usually kids because I feel like stories fascinate kids the most. And what inspired me to actually go through with all of this is this one book I read, City of My Heart by Rana Safvi. Um, it was the first time I read an account of Delhi in 1857 after it fell to the British from our perspective. And that just sort of shook me that everything I've been reading in my history books, online, and articles, that was not it. That's not my side of the story. And it was so painful to read it. And that really just sort of shook me. And I was like, okay, we need to tell our own stories.
Hmm. Oh, that's very cool. I think it is really interesting what you're saying about illustrations and actually being able to see things, because I think sometimes, yeah, you do remember something more when there's like a visual to go with it.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm. Cool. Well, I'll put the links for things that I always point downwards on YouTube because like people don't know where the show notes are. It's really embarrassing. And I point out the fact that I do it every time, which is even worse. Um, I'll put the links below so that people can come and see what you've been doing and they can come and look at your website because you've got some really cool stuff on there. So I'll make sure that people can come and check you out. Have you got any final last words that you'd like to say to sort of, I don't know, bring a little bit of folklore into Valentine's Day?
Um, I think you should always believe in the universe and believe in the magic of stories, because every one of us does have the power to write a story. You just need to learn to follow your heart. You will see things happen to you which you have prayed for all your life, which you never even thought were possible, and they just sort of renew your faith in a way which you never even thought was possible. And we're going to be starting a new initiative soon. I got in together with some colleagues from India and from Bangladesh. We're starting a folklore society of South Asia. And when that comes out, I will be really looking forward to connect with more people. All of you are welcome, and yes, please support our work.
Cool. I think that's an excellent way to end that. So make sure you send me details about that and then I'll spam Twitter and stuff with it. Or X or whatever my
I
different.
will definitely do that. And thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to speak to you.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for listening, and I hoped you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes. So if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.